Today's lecture focuses on labor unions, the Red Scare, and the pushback against immigration post-World War I through the early 1920s in American history. Now, to understand the large impact of what was going on at the time, you must understand, again, that there were millions of American soldiers that were transitioning back from Europe back to the United States. Now, this is going to be a difficult transition not only for them, but also for those people that had taken their jobs during World War I, specifically women and African Americans that had moved north during the Great Migration. Now, this overall shift from wartime production to normalcy was a difficult one for American industries. Throughout the majority of the war, you had the War Industries Board that had controlled the United States economy, literally directing American businesses and manufacturers with quotas of what products they were supposed to produce. So when the war was over and the War Industries Board was no longer in service, American businesses had to pick up literally where they had left off years. And so many soldiers that were returning home, a lot of times there was pushback in regards to them getting their jobs back, because many of them had been employed at a much higher wage. When they were replaced by cheaper African American and women labor, a lot of the times they were left with unemployment. You also had increased government spending throughout the post-World War I period and increased spending in the economy, which will lead to inflation.
Now, during World War I, there literally were no strikes. The National War Labor Board worked hand in hand with labor unions and manufacturers to try to keep instances of labor uprisings at an absolute minimum. And so because of that, labor unions throughout the war period had enjoyed a great amount of success. Overall wages had increased and union membership increased by quite a bit. However, after the war ended, there was definitely an opportunity, because now without the War Industries Board regulating relations between manufacturers and labor unions, just in 1919 alone, you are going to see 3,600 strikes occur, with over 4 million workers going on strike in a variety of businesses. Now, obviously, that's going to have a major impact, where you go from a period in which there were literally no strikes to a period in which you have almost 4,000 strikes in 1 year. There definitely is an issue there, especially in terms of American opinion against labor unions. Now, you must remember that during World War I, the Russians actually exited the war in 1917. Now, reasons for that, they actually had two revolutions that occurred. One in February, in which the Tsar, Nicholas II of the Romanov family, was deposed. He was replaced by a temporary government that continued the war effort. Later on in October, they were replaced by a much more radical, small-scale movement called Bolshevism. Now, Bolshevism it was specifically Russian, and it was a movement of communism. With the exit of Russia from World War I and the October Revolution, which installed the Bolsheviks as the leading party in Russia, what happened with the Russian Empire is it became a one-party communist state. Now, to be able to understand what exactly that means, there's definitely a stark difference between capitalism and communism. Now, communism was not a new belief system. The Communist Manifesto was a book that was actually written in 1848 by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And in the Communist Manifesto, communists were pushing towards changing the structure in which society was set up. Communists lobbied that, though for the longest time the middle and upper classes had controlled all segments of economics and government. And with the communist uprising, which is what Marx and Engels believed, they believed that that capitalist system that was controlled by the bourgeoisie, or the upper middle classes to upper classes, would be replaced by an economy that was controlled by the workers. Now, that was the way that they wanted to spread communism, and when the Russian Empire installed communism as their type of government, this was the first instance in which a communist regime had taken over full scale.
Now, Russia wasn't the model place for it to occur because it was supposed to be a place in which there was a highly industrialized society, i.e. like a Germany, a Great Britain, or the United States. But nonetheless, communists had their first example of a one-party communist state in which they could grow communism. Now, what is the backbone of communism? Well, first, what would happen is the government would take over private industries, both farms, manufacturing, businesses, and all of those things became state-owned. Then from there, workers were actually paid a wage by the state. So technically your employer was the government. And under communism, the government sets pretty much all quotas for manufacturing. They set prices. They are literally hands-on in terms of the economy. Now, most communist systems actually have a lack of individualism, meaning that things are typically shared collectively, including farms. Now, Russia actually had a history of collective farms in a system what was known as the Mir, which after the peasants, after the serfs had received their independence from landowners, basically all lands were set aside in a communal village known as the Mir. So that sort of system had existed for quite a while. But in communist systems, what will ultimately develop is a lack of human rights. Now, I'm not saying that, in capitalist economies like the United States, we're all humans treated equally. Later on, we'll have a handful of lectures where we'll talk about the African Americans and, of course, their mistreatment when they moved to the North during the Great Migration. So, by no means is the United States absolutely clean in that either. But from the start, this communist regime in Russia will establish a system that will put the state, and especially the Communist Party, above all other interests. Now, how does this affect the United States? Well, first off, there were a handful of bomb scares that occurred basically from the time period of 1910 up until the early 1920s. In 1910, there was a bomb that blew up at the Los Angeles Times headquarters, and it killed a handful of people, and it was tied back to a Union member. In 1920, there was a bomb that blew up in front of the New York Stock Exchange, and it killed over 40 people and injured over 100 more. And so these bombings, combined with earlier bombings and other terrorist-type activities, were often linked to labor unions, because labor unions, there was often a lot of radical elements, both communists, you had anarchists who believed in the overthrow of any sort of government at all, and you do have some socialist elements in there as well. So because of this, and because of all of the new strikes that had occurred post-World War I, the 1920s becomes a time period in which labor unions are mistrusted, and union membership will actually go down. And a big part of that is because of a phenomenon known as the Red Scare, in which these labor unions would be tied directly to communist activities. Now, in the Communist Manifesto, and in Vladimir Lenin's beliefs, he's the first leader of the Communist Soviet Union, by the way, the government that replaced the Russian Empire, his belief was that the Soviet Union's responsibility was to spread communism throughout. There goes my phone going off at that time. That the Soviet Union was supposed to spread communism through the rest of the world. That was their job and their duty, which makes sense because they believe in that type of government being supreme above all else. So because of this fear over the possibility of communism or anarchy spreading to the United States, the federal government took a stance in which they were going to try to find those communists, anarchists, socialists, or any other radical elements, and they would try to push those people out. And, of course, a lot of people that were suspected of being these radicals came from the lower classes, the working classes, those people that would have normally been in labor unions, and especially people that were immigrants. And we'll connect that point back later. So, in August of 1919, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer appoints J. Edgar Hoover, you'll hear his name literally for the rest of this course, as his assistant, and they begin the practice of going against and going after suspected communists, radicals, and anarchists. So in a series of Palmer raids, named after Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, they basically ordered the arrest of thousands of communists, socialists, and anarchists. They would literally bust into places, they would arrest them, and a lot of times they would charge them, they were being deported, and a lot of times they were doing it without even having to face any sort of trials at all. So the legality of the Palmer raids were technically not in with the Constitution. Now, the perfect example of communist and anarchist activities that are being cracked down upon by the federal government is the case of Secco and Vanzetti. Now, Nicola Secco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, who were two first-generation Italian immigrants that were living near Boston, Massachusetts. Now, Secco and Vanzetti, as they are most commonly known, they were two anarchists that wanted to overthrow any sort of government. Now, where the story of these two actually goes awry is in May of 1920, there were two factory workers, or there were two paymasters that were shot and killed at a shoemaking factory in Braintree, Massachusetts. Now, the two, Secco and Vanzetti, were arrested, and they both were armed at the time of their arrest. And so during the court trial, they had to try to talk about how they were armed because they were anarchists and all of this. And what it was believed, the jury was swayed because of them having to profess the fact that they were anarchists, and so the jury had a built-up prejudice against these two. Now, there was all sort of information that went against the idea that Secco and Vanzetti were actually guilty. There were alibis saying that they were both separate on that particular day, and that they weren't even near Braintree, Massachusetts. There was also a member, a person that came forward that said he was part of the robbery, and that in the mention of this, Secco and Vanzetti, actually, their names never came up in it. And there was ballistic evidence as well that attempted to disprove that Secco and Vanzetti were guilty. But ultimately what ends up happening is that Secco and Vanzetti, they'll be sentenced
to death. In 1927, they will die in the electric chair. Now, what sort of backlash did this have? There were actually movements around the world, places like London and Johannesburg and in Italy, trying to get a new trial for Secco and Vanzetti. However, what this particular trial shows is that the United States was becoming much more conservative and actually becoming not only anti-labor union, anti-radical, but also anti-immigration. And ultimately what is happening and what is going to happen is we came out of a time period of profound immigration to the United States. And instead what is going to replace it is a quota system. So that so-called golden gates of opportunity will now be closed. And there will be a very limited number of people to actually gain entry into the United States. Immigration of Europeans will drop dramatically, especially those immigrants, the southern portions of Europe. That particular movement of Keep America for the Americans, it urged people to act against communists and to act against European immigrants and to try to intimidate those people to either act more American or ultimately to get out. So both the Red Scare and anti-immigration attitude led to the reformation or the return of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. Now, if you remember, the Ku Klux Klan was originally a social group that was formed in Tennessee in the post-Civil War South. And ultimately what it developed into was a terrorist organization that kept African Americans from being socially acclimated and also from being politically registered as voters. Now over time what had happened is membership in the KKK sort of died out as the South returned kind of to a system of its old way in which white power rose to prominence and the African American community kind of separated itself off in the South. Now, of course, with African Americans moving to the north and with the Red Scare and with, a lot of hatred towards immigrants after World War I, there's going to be a renewed membership in terms of the KKK. And actually by 1924, membership will be up to 4.5 million members, which is interesting because before, the majority of the KKK's membership was actually in the southern states.
At this time, you're actually going to see a very large increase in the amount of northern people joining the KKK. And in fact, the Ku Klux Klan, the second version, became so successful that they actually had a mail-order catalog, very similar to the Sears and Roebuck's catalog, in which you could order your gowns and your hoods and all other KKK-type merchandise. And so, ultimately, the Ku Klux Klan will resume its role as a terrorist-type organization, and for their involvement in a series of crimes, it's going to turn not only the federal government, but public opinion against the Klan, and ultimately, by the end of the 1930s, they'll be pushed out once again. So I just wanted to thank you again for watching. Hopefully this lecture sheds a little bit of light on how labor unions were perceived, how the Red Scare unfolded, and how there was a pushback against immigrants post-World War I in the early 1920s. Thanks again for watching, and remember, never stop learning.
Some of these days you'll miss me, honey. Some of these days you're gonna be so lonely. You'll miss my hugging. You're gonna miss my kissing. You're gonna miss me, honey, when I'm gone.